Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's easy to get started with the next generation of deployment and scaling, powered by the battle-tested Linode platform, including simple pricing, node balancers, 40 gigabit networking, and dedicated CPU and GPU instances. And now you can launch a managed MySQL, Postgres, or Mongo database cluster in minutes to keep your critical data safe with automated backups and failover. Go to pythonpodcast.com/Linode today to get a $100 credit to try out their new database service, and don't forget to thank them for the continued support of this show. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Florian Wilhelm about PyScaffold, a Python project template generator with batteries included. So, Florian, can you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. So, my name is Florian. I'm head of data science at Innovex. We are an IT project house. I got a PhD in numerical mathematics, and then I started in the field of data science. And throughout the whole time, even also in my studies, I was using Python. And it's cool to be here at this podcast.
And do you remember how you first got started working with Python?
Yeah, actually, it was even during my school times, when I remember correctly. So when I was doing internship at SAP, which is like one of the largest software companies in Germany, and there I had to learn Perl for scripting. It was whole Perl 5.4, I guess. And back then I was quite excited about Perl, but one of the colleagues told me that I should definitely also look into Python. And so he convinced me to take a look into Python, and I pretty much directly loved it and preferred it to Perl because it was way more readable and easier. And this is what got me started.
One of my favorite jokes about Perl is that most programming languages are write once, read many, and Perl is write once, read never.
Yeah. That's exactly what they say about Perl, yeah.
And so in terms of the PyScaffold project, can you describe a bit about what it is and some of the motivation that you had for building it and some of the overall goals that you had when you started it?
Yeah, sure. So when I was doing my PhD, so it was in numerical mathematics, so we also started to use Python as a kind of glue code for all our numerics code in C++ and Fortran. And in this research group, I was the guy who was really excited about Python and told everyone about Python, and people started using it. But then everyone was more like scripting in Python, wanted to kind of help everyone to write proper packages so that we could share our software components. And the first thing I did, I was writing a huge wiki page. I think it was in Redmine or what kind of wiki there was at the time. So I was writing like a whole documentation about, have this setup.py and you should put this in there and don't forget to add this and this is how you should do it. And when I later joined the first company after my PhD, I was also kind of taking this wiki with me, all the knowledge I have gathered. And also in the first company at Blue Yonder, we also started to use Python for C++ code. And then I realized after a while, no one is actually reading my documentation anymore because it has grown to like 20, 30 pages. And I thought, why not just create some project generator for helping people to apply all the best practices, everything from the docs really easily, because the actual barrier was for them to read the docs, and having some kind of project generator that bootstraps your code and you can easily start using it is way easier to just use. And this is basically then, it was back in 2014, Blue Yonder at the time was the company I was working for, where I had this idea. I pitched it with my boss. He gave me some time to work on this and also allowed it to be open sourced, which I'm really grateful for that they allowed it. And this is how it all got started. And then after, now it's 8 years ago, it started to grow and constantly evolve. And the rest is history.
The context of the fact that you started it 8 years ago is interesting because if you were to go today and look for, I just need a template for X project, there are all kinds of different options out there. There are different cookie cutter templates. Some of them are one-off. There are some kind of generalized options. And I'm wondering, at the time that you started the project, what the kind of available landscape looked like for somebody who just wanted to say, I just want a template that gives me a Python package that has all of the basic setup that I need so that I don't have to read through, reams of documentation to figure out which configuration parameters to put where and what the package architecture needs to look like.
Yeah. So back at the time, I think it was also about the time when cookie cutters started actually, and they also have a Python template. But at the time, I was not really convinced. So I had different ideas how to tackle this problem. And so basically the main idea was, so the cookie cutter you can basically use for everything, right? So you can roll your own templates. It's really easy to configure your own templates, but you still have to have a kind of knowledge, right? Or if you look on their web page now, you have like tons of different templates, and somehow you need to decide, so what is the right template for me and what are the pros and cons of each template? And still you have to kind of read a little bit in the documentation what it is really for and how you should use it. And the idea with PyScaffold is more or less that you have something really opinionated. That's kind of a best practice approach that comes with everything that you need to get started developing your own package really easily. And then there are like extensions that kind of deviate, that change a little bit the kind of basis, but it's not a complete new template. It's a different approach. So there's this core template and you can alter it a little bit, which is in contrast to cookie cutter, where you can have like complete different templates that are completely independent of each other. And I like the PyScaffold approach more. So the vision, the goal always was to have like this one go-to tool for beginners of packaging that you can just, you install PyScaffold, you run put up my project, and you have already a really nice scaffold there that comes with everything you need. You can easily build your package. You can upload it to PyPy. You can run talks for your unit tests using PyTest. You can build your documentation using things. You have pre-commit, for instance, configured to have like Black and Flake 8 and so on. And everything like is included. And also you have this nice documentation that we built over the years. So the web page explaining what everything is, what everything does. And then you can kind of start step by step, like using all those best practices. And I think this helps people a lot, because if they weren't using PyScaffold, they would have to make a lot of decisions. So what they should use, what kind of build system. I mean, nowadays there's like, you can also use Poetry instead of setup tools. You can use PDM, then there's Hedge. So there's many different tools, and also for documentations, different tools, and how to configure those. I think you can easily spend more than 1 week like just configuring your package and your whole development setup. But in the end, what you want to do is to develop where you're working on your project, your idea. And so PyScaffold helps you to get really fast to that point where you can start just hacking away on your idea, and everything else is already with sane defaults covered in PyScaffold. So this is our main goal.
As you mentioned, there are a large and growing number of options for any particular use case or any aspect of the kind of environment setup or the way that you structure your projects. And before we get too much into the details of which choices you've made where, I'm interested in discussing kind of the categories or types of applications that you're focused on supporting with PyScaffold, and some of the ways that those areas of focus developed both from your own usage and some of the evolution of the project over time.
One main focus, you can build a library with PyScaffold, also some real Python application where you have console scripts and so on. So this is all supported. Then for specific applications, maybe thinking about like more data science or data-oriented application, there are some extensions also for web application, the Django extension, for instance. We developed those extensions whenever we needed them. Since I'm in the field of data science, I wrote the DS project for the data science project extension, and everyone can just contribute extensions whenever they want. But yeah, we are completely open in this regard to whoever wants to contribute a new extension for some really specific use case. For instance, I saw last time I checked that someone had like a extension for Visual Studio Code together with a container configuration, because this one person seems to develop with the help of Visual Studio Code and some containerized setup. And basically everything's possible with the help of the extension system. And I think at that point, huge shout out to Anderson Bravalieri, because he's right now the core maintainer of PyScaffold, and he introduced the extension system back then. So he changed a lot to make this possible, to have really to have extensions easily available in PyScaffold.
I'm definitely interested in digging into the extension system a bit, but before we get there, as far as the kind of decision-making aspect of saying for this type of project, so for a Django project, these are the, different basic plugins that you want to use. This is how we're going to default the project structure. We're going to use Poetry or PDM, or, just curious if you can talk through what your process was for deciding on what constituted best practices, both across all of the templates that you use in PyScaffold and for kind of each specific use case for a given project.
Yeah, so of course, everything's kind of opinionated. So we had huge discussions with several people from the Python community, or sometimes it was also just like trying out different tools. And so PyScaffold right now has been using setup tools, because this is like the big default way of building Python packages. And since also setup tools evolved a lot, it's still used also a lot and has all the features that are needed. So we looked at different tools, for instance, Poetry, but on the other hand, Poetry itself also comes with a kind of minimal project setup. And it also directly includes managing your whole virtual environments. And we wanted to have those separated, that you, for instance, can also use Anaconda, which is maybe a little bit more preferred in the field of data science for managing isolated environments. And so basically we evaluated different ways and looked, of course, at a lot of other open source tools, how they are doing. And this kind of, then helped us to kind of extract what we think are the best practices from different projects. And of course, this evolves over time. For instance, when we started, like in 2014, it was completely normal that you would write a setup.py, right? Because at first, Python was like, we can configure everything with the power of Python itself. And then later on, the whole community realized, okay, but being declarative is actually much better. So we should give up some of the huge power of Python and go over to some configuration file. And at first, this was a setup.cfg. And we welcomed this and implemented this too in PyScaffold, and we are always keeping up with what setup tools does, so that our users always have the current and most modern way of setting up setup tools. And now, I think since a few months, it's also possible to completely configure setup tools with the help of pyproject.toml. This is also going to be like the next step, what we're going to do. Then for documentation, I think, it was from the start pretty clear that Sphinx is the one go-to tool. Right now, we are also evaluating mkdocs. which it seems like the community is like growing more on the MK docs side. When we started, most of the docs were written in restructured text, but nowadays Markdown is much more preferred. So we first started this as an extension that you could say, okay, I want to rather write it in Markdown. And now we are thinking about maybe just to completely switch over so that your default project directly is all in Markdown. But these are just ideas because we kind of want a way to have it standardized. And unit tests, I think in the beginning, before PyTest became really big, there were also a lot of other unit testing tools that we first checked out. And yeah, this is how we kind of look what happens in the community. We also get, for instance, Anderson, he's like reading all those PEPs before going to sleep, it seems. So he knows all the PEPs and what we should implement next and so on. And then there's also a guy from Setup Tools SCM, Ronny Pfannschmidt. So he developed this tool, Setup Tools SCM. And this tool allows you to do semantic versioning and kind of bridges the gap between Git and the version strings of your Python package. So you can just tag a certain commit, and this version is then also used directly in the metadata of your project. And this allows you to avoid any kind of conflicts, because you want this to be always consistent, right? What you have in Git and what kind of packages you're building. And he's also giving a lot of really valuable suggestions to PyScaffold. For instance, he suggested that we change to the source layout so that you don't have the actual Python package at the root of your project, but that you rather have a source directory and the package is a subdirectory of the source, because this has a lot of advantages. And so this is basically how those best practices. So we listen to different ideas, we discuss them, and then we look, okay, who else is doing this? And is this already kind of a mainstream? And then we include it into PyScaffold.
The kind of determination of what is mainstream is also interesting, because it also depends a bit on who you're looking to for kind of signals, where some kind of areas of the community are focused on, everything should be in poetry and we use PyProject.toml for everything. Other people are looking to some of the newer PEPs, where I think PDM is one of the package managers that uses the directory-based dependency management, so that you can have sort of like a NPM style where you just install your packages into the project directory. You don't have to worry about managing your virtual environment. And I'm interested in your general kind of philosophy and approach for how you determine what your opinions are about how you want things to be done, and how you balance that against the tendency for a project as it goes on to just add more and more configuration flags, so that by the end of it, you might as well just do all the work yourself from scratch rather than rely on the, so-called opinionated approach, because the opinions become diluted because there are so many options.
Yeah, if we were actually now to switch setup tools for something else, then we would maybe over some time have a kind of, an extra flag to go back to setup tools. But then we kind of would drop setup tools if this ever happens. So we are still in discussion, and setup tools for me is still a good way to build your Python packages. But the idea is not to just add more and more and more, as you said, but to kind of replace then after a while, like one thing with the other, because you don't need to build tools actually. So you have to decide anyway for a single one. And since we want to be a tool that you can just put up my project, and then someone makes a decision for you and gives you the default one where we think it's a good choice for you. And I mean, right now, all those different things, build systems and also environment managers like PDM, Hatch, Poetry, there are so many. And right now it's really hard to say who's going to win in the end. And this is where we just kind of take our time and wait And also, actually, right now, PyScaffold doesn't really come with a way of managing your virtual environment. So it's completely agnostic, which I think is good. So you can do whatever you want. You can even use pipenv if you want to use this, or you can use Anaconda, whatever you want, because we are concentrating on this single thing, which is giving you a nice Python project setup. So it's not about managing your environments. There you can still choose whatever you want. Maybe poetry, of course, would be a little bit difficult because, we use setup tools. So you would have to replace then but in the end, after we have done the switch to PyProject Toml, it should hopefully be only like one line in the beginning of PyProject Toml, where you define your build system. And then you could even use poetry. So actually, if you want to develop a Python library or application, you should not care that much about the build system in the best case, because this should be completely transparent for you. It should just know the command how to build a wheel and not decide, okay, should I rather go for, there's also Flit. There's so many different tools, and some implement those PEPs, some implement, there's also PyFlux or something that only comes with this new way of the __ Py packages. So this way of not having isolated environments at all. And so this is still some beast. We kind of say, okay, we are agnostic. Who knows if we later are going to adopt something or not. So I would rather actually keep or stick to the Unix philosophy, which is do one thing and do it really well. And a project setup has actually, or should in best case, have nothing to do with how you manage your virtual environment, right? This should be kind of orthogonal to it.
Absolutely. You should just build the wheel, not reinvent it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then in terms of the actual implementation of PyScaffold, I'm wondering if you can talk to some of the ways that the project is designed and some of the choices that you've had to make in terms of how it is managed and structured and the evolution that it has gone through as the overall ecosystem and the adoption of best practices has changed.
Yes, so from implementation perspective, we always try to keep things as simple as possible, right? So we also have nice documentation about this for beginners who want to contribute to PyScaffold. And basically we have a module for the command line interface. Then we have a module for our internal APIs, so how to create a project. And then the basic principle is that the structure of your project, which is a kind of nested dictionary with the files and the content of the files, and this put into a pipeline called the action pipeline. And each step of this action pipeline, which can be create a file or check the consistency of flags or make sure that Git is there or initialized, this is then applied on each step on this structure. And in the end structure at the end of the pipeline is then kind of deployed on your hard drive. So this is the basic idea. And this also gives the flexibility. So if your extension introduces another flag, then you have access to that flag, and basically you define a new action in this pipeline. You can say it should be run after another step in this pipeline. And this gives you the whole flexibility to change at that point the project structure however you want it. And this is basically the whole magic. So I think it's kind of really simple to understand what's going on. And throughout the time, a lot changed. So when we started, we wanted to have this versioning feature in there. I think it was way before setup tools SCM was actually invented. So we were using Versioneer for that. And also we wanted to have declarative configuration options. So there was a time when we used this Python build reasonableness. So it's from OpenStack, PBR. So we were using this and we were vendorizing those packages. And later on, we decided to rather use like real dependencies for this. So the reason for vendorizing it was that we were at that time a kind of development requirement. So we tried not to have that many dependencies. So we would just package everything into PyScaffold. So this changed in version 4. So there were a lot of kind of architecture changes throughout the time. And I think the biggest one was the change to have an extension system that Anderson introduced. And he also helped to structure and reorganize the source code a lot, which helped us to maintain this over so many years. Because, I mean, when I started it, 8 years is already kind of long for a Python project, right? So much happened even to the Python language. There was also the switch from Python 2 to Python 3. And in the beginning, we wanted to support this. So we had 6 also in the templates to help people develop a package that runs for Python 2 and 3 at the same time. This then also got dropped after a while because nowadays you basically don't care about Python 2 anymore, right? So, and this is how we evolve this. And for version 4, we also took the time to just see what happened over those 8 years. So I don't know if you know this GORS, if it's pronounced like this. This is visualization tool for Git, where you just put in your whole Git repo and then it creates some nice visualization. We put the PyScaffold repo in this tool, and I think it's a 4-minute video where you can see easily how much has changed over those 8 years. Really, a lot has changed over those 8 years, and sometimes it was a real challenge to keep up with all the changes and all the tabs. And sometimes it's also hard to say no to people kind of suggesting new features and saying, okay, please, could we also have this and that? And then you think about, okay, it's not only implementing it, it's also maintaining it over many years, and kind of removing something from a package. It's much easier, it's much harder than actually adding something. So you also always have to keep this kind of balance between not adding too many features because you have to maintain everything. On the other hand, you also want to be like welcoming to new contributors and to also allow them to implement their ideas and help improve PyScaffold. So
another aspect of the work that you're doing is that by being opinionated, you have to make your own determination about what constitutes best practices. And as you mentioned, that means staying up to date with the different conversations that are happening, the PEPs that are being adopted, the changes to the Python language and ecosystem. And in your work of doing that, I'm curious what you see as being the kind of noisiest or most volatile elements of what constitutes best practices, and what are the pieces that are largely stable or widely agreed on. So I know that black, for instance, is generally accepted as a good choice. Obviously, there are people who have their own opinions who dissent, but it's fairly uncontroversial versus the question of kind of environment management that you were discussing earlier of poetry versus pipenv versus PDM, et cetera. And I'm wondering what you see as kind of the most stable versus most volatile elements of that ecosystem.
So definitely something like Plague and Flake 8, and also I would say pre-commit. So also having this end of line fixer and white space and everything that helps you kind of have a certain standardized style in your Python project. There is, I think, a lot of agreement that those tools make sense. Also for unit tests, PyTest is still the go-to tool, I would say, and also Tox for running tests. For a long time, with regard to documentation, it used to be strings, but as we mentioned before, people also use mkdocs. And what I like about mkdocs, that it also has a declarative way of configuration, and strings, on the other hand, has this conf.py, where you also use Python for configuration. So then more and more people are adapting type hintings. So this is still like not 100% used, but there's a lot of agreement that people really like it. And I mean, if you used Python doc strings to document your source code, you would anyway write, if it's a list of int or a list of characters or whatever, a list of strings. And yeah, having this now directly in the parameters of your function and the return value, I mean, it's much easier to read, and you have many benefits. For instance, like static type checking, and there's also tools that even compile your Python code, like the MyPy compiler and so on. So there's a lot of things going on in this regard. So yeah, MyPy is definitely something I would say, or it doesn't have to be MyPy. I mean, also other tools, but type hinting, I would say, is, many people agree with it, and this is here to stay. And we also want to support this more in PyScaffold. Then when it comes to the build system, this is like really hard to say what's going to happen there in the future. So I actually hope that setup tools is going to be the winner, because I mean, it also does this one thing, and it does it also well. It has a kind of legacy code base. So this is maybe why people have their problems with it. And sometimes, it has some really rough edges, so to say. So I had a lot of fun trying to understand what's going on in setup tools, but I think it's improving a lot. So the Python Package Authority, the PyPA, I mean, they also have Flit, which is like a lightweight version of setup tools, so to say, but it also is missing a lot of features, like you can only have pure Python packages, so no compiled code. You don't have an extension system. For instance, what I explained before, this having semantic versioning directly from Git in your metadata of your Python package is not possible with Flit, which I think is a downside. So I'm not a huge fan of it, I must say, but there are many others. I haven't really evaluated so much PDM right now. And this new PEP with the local environments, with the Py packages. But then again, there's also Poetry and Hatch. Hatch is definitely cool, I would say, because it already comes with a lot of features. But this is, I would say, the part where there's the most fluctuations, where it's not really sure what is going to happen. And I think on the one hand, it's kind of nice that people are inventing new stuff, but on the other hand, it's also a huge distraction, because in the best way, you want to have this one tool that you just use and it does whatever you want, and you develop, like other languages like Rust, for instance, come with Cargo, where you have this one go tool how to handle everything. And it's actually a pity that Python had over like almost decades now so much pain with handling your dependencies, with installing things and so on. And with respect to other things, like I would say the source layout of a Python package is also many benefits of it, so that you, for instance, cannot accidentally test something completely different because you import the package directly, not whatever you installed. So this, I think, is also kind of, it makes sense. And most people agree that you should set up your project like this. Also that you should have a license file or a file called contributing, and a readme.markdown or .rst. So the overall, and that your docs folders should be named docs, and you have a test folder. So certain things are already kind of, pretty defined. And I don't think that the overall like structure from a directory perspective is going to change a lot. But of course, some tools, especially the build systems, I think they will surely change a lot. And let's see who's going to win in the end.
In terms of the extension system that you mentioned earlier, I'm wondering if you can talk to some of the ways that enables people to use PyScaffold as a utility and build their own templates, and maybe some details on sort of how the templates are implemented as compared to maybe a cookie cutter template.
The templates of PyScaffold are just Python packages themselves, so you can just pip install them. And they're using the Python hooking system, so the entry points basically, so that PyScaffold can discover those extensions, and they are discovered, and then you define your flags and your actions, and then you can also define where in the pipeline this extension, your action is going to be placed. So it's really not that hard to write an own extension, and we also wrote an extension to write PyScaffold extensions. So you can just pip install PyScaffold -custom -extension, and then you have a special flag, and then you get a project setup that already includes all the necessary subfolders and has some stubs with pseudocode, or not some pseudocode, with like all the boilerplate code that you need to write your own PyScaffold extension. And of course, also the documentation, I think at that point, is really great. So it's not that hard to write your own extension. What Cookie Cutter does is clone some GitHub repo which uses Jinja or Jinja 2 to define the overall structure, and then there's some substitutions going on. So I think this is like really different to how we do it. So I must say that, of course, it's easier. So if you are already using Jinja a lot, then it's easier to write your own cookie cutter template. But on the other hand, I mean, for a cookie cutter template, you would then need to decide first, okay, from which of the many templates are out there, I want to kind of clone it and then do your changes. And in case of PyScaffold, you always know that you have this core set up that is also going to evolve over time. And then your extension just defines how you differ from this core definition of your project. And so this also means that maintaining your extension is way easier for PyScaffold. And it's a different thinking in this regard, that you only define the changes and not like I copy everything and modify in place.
For somebody who's getting started, you mentioned that you have this put up command to generate the scaffolds. For somebody who maybe already has an existing project and wants to migrate to adopt some of the opinions that you have encoded in PyScaffold, or for somebody who started a project in PyScaffold, but the underlying template has evolved, what are the options for being able to incorporate those changes into that existing project?
We have a migration documentation about this. What you can basically do, it's again really simple. So just make sure that your current project already uses Git. I mean, this is, for instance, also something which is here to stay. So everyone uses Git, right? There's no doubt about it anymore. So almost everyone agrees on this. This is also a requirement for PyScaffold. So let's assume that your current project, you're using Git. Just make sure that you have a clean repository, everything's checked in, and then you just go to the parent directory and type put up -force and the name of your project. And then PyScaffold is kind of overwriting your current project setup with its own files. And then you can just git merge tool and git diff to kind of change whatever you need to change. So it depends. If you already have a kind of similar project setup, of course, there won't be that many changes. Yeah, if it's completely different, for instance, if you don't have the source layout, there's some steps you can do before, but everything is written in the documentation. Of course, this process like this cannot really be automated because we never know how your project might look like. But I would say the process shouldn't cost you more than, let's say, 2 or 3 hours, depending on how large your project is. And yeah, it's kind of easy.
In your experience of building PyScaffold and using it and kind of evolving the project and now handing it off to a new maintainer, I'm wondering what your overall approach to community engagement has been, as far as, do you have any maybe voting process for deciding what are the right opinions to have or sort of who to listen to, and what your approach has been for kind of bringing on your new maintainer and handing over the reins? Because that's one of the kind of least formalized or least understood approaches in open source, as far as like, how do you, as somebody who just starts a project because it's a problem that you want to solve, then say, okay, this is how I am going to manage the kind of ownership and life cycle of this project once I've moved on to other things?
That's a hard question. So I also, I'm really open to all kinds of ideas and suggestions how to do this. Our current approach, and I think it worked quite well, is first of all, always be welcoming to new contributors and trust new people always. So you should not be too hesitant, and listen to their ideas, kind of then also challenge their ideas, but in a nice way, and discuss first new ideas before you get some huge pull requests that changes like 80% of your code base. This can be formalized. So we have a lot of documentation about, as I said before, how our code looks like, also how to do your first pull requests. So really, like from the beginning, like you click the clone button in GitHub and so on. So everything is included, and this helps new people making their first pull requests. And we also had pull requests just fixing typos, which I really liked. And then I find it really important because it's, of course, writing open source code in most cases is nobody is paying for it, right? So whenever someone wants to contribute, they're kind of giving you their spare time in most cases, right? And I think this should always be appreciated. So if someone takes the time to fix our typos in PyScaffold, so we are really grateful for this. And I think it's important to show this in a community, that you write, hey, thanks a lot. We also mentioned those in our, as authors, as contributors to PyScaffold and so on. So this is really important to have this like welcoming way for new contributors, and always also explaining things when there are questions, of course. Also important is that when someone tries to make a first pull request, not to just think, okay, I can now implement whatever they asked for myself in maybe 2 hours because I know the code base, but rather to say, okay, you could implement it like this, and why don't you make a pull request for it, so that people kind of get motivated. Okay, there's someone helping, and I write a small, maybe new unit test or whatever, and they fix a little problem, and then they have their first pull request, and this gets many people motivated then to go on and to maybe write a huger feature for PyScaffold and so on. And then there's always like trust. For instance, I trust Anderson like 100%. And I've known him now for many years. And of course, if he has an opinion on something, this opinion is like really valuable. And this is also why I said like, okay, I want to also go on to other projects. So still I want to contribute, but since you have been doing like the most work and the greatest feature in the last years, you have been implemented. So you should be the core maintainer of PyScaffold. And this is like the usual kind of, if you call it ring of trust, or you have certain people known them for many years, they've done an awesome job. And of course, you trust them more, in contrast to someone coming in and saying, okay, I want to change completely the goal of PyScaffold. Still, in this case, one has to be like really also, again, appreciate that they have cool ideas, but in a nice way saying no. And this like learning to say no in an open source project for me was the hardest thing, because you have motivated people and they say, okay, let's add this and here's the pull request. And I've already put like maybe days of work into my pull request, so please accept it. And then saying no, this changes the whole project into a direction that we kind of don't want to go. It's the hardest part, but I think it's also something you have to do as an open source maintainer, because otherwise you're kind of losing the goal of your project. So yeah, but I think there's a lot to learn still for us and for me how to do this. And as you said, I think maybe there's no best way how to do, how to work with the open source community. Yeah, but again, some best practices, I assume.
In your work of building and using the project and engaging with the community, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen PyScaffold used?
I really like seeing that people are using the custom extensions, building their own like really specific extensions for their certain needs, like this something like called the B project and this Visual Studio Code. And someone also added an interactive shell for PyScaffold. So beforehand, everything was just that you define the configuration flags for PyScaffold. So one person, he built this interactive way, which I found really surprising because I actually never needed it, but we realized then due to him and also that other people were using this project that he built that we should have this as a core feature. Yeah, but other than that, yeah, I think, most people are using PyScaffold as it is intended, and we are always happy to hear when people are using it. And so if you're using PyScaffold, so to the listeners, let us know about it. Just use the GitHub discussions and tell us about it. We are really happy to hear what kind of projects you're using PyScaffold for, if it helps you or how it can be improved.
In your work of building the project and growing it and now adding a new maintainer, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you learned in the process?
For me, this was my first open source project. All the community aspects that we discussed before, this was really challenging. And we have a few core contributors, but I would love to see a lot more people contributing to PyScaffold and building this up. So this was really challenging. Also, keeping up with all the PEPs, of course, and that Python itself is really changing so rapidly. So the whole language, I rather thought it's going to be like maybe in C++ or so, that you have like a new standard every 4 or 5 years or whatever, so that things are not changing so quickly. But Python has such a huge speed. Also, the whole ecosystem is changing. And this is definitely has been really surprising to me, and it's still a huge challenge to keep up with this.
For people who are looking for ways to be able to quickly scaffold or bootstrap a project, or they're looking for an example of best practices for how to approach their application structure, what are the cases where PyScaffold is the wrong choice?
I think it's the wrong choice if you want to have an application that deeply integrates into your operation system, because then you would maybe rather go for some operation system specific packaging solution like a Debian package or Flatpak, Snap, whatever. But it's also the case for other Python packaging systems. And I think if you work, for instance, for a company or for some reason, the context you're working in demands a really specific setup, you're kind of deviating too much from what PyScaffold is giving you, then it really might make sense to use, for instance, cookie cutter instead and roll your whole template. And this can be really a case where your own template that you then also, of course, have to maintain makes more sense. But if you kind of just want to get going, then PyScaffold is a better choice.
In terms of the near to medium term, what are some of the things that you and your co-maintainer have planned for, new capabilities or new areas of use, or just some of the projects that you're excited to dig into?
In the next version, we definitely want to adapt PyProject TOML completely, because this is now possible with the new setup tools version. So setup.cfg is completely going to disappear, and all the metadata of your project, everything is going to be nicely in PyProject TOML. Also, we heard from the community that people rather want to have like one file with all the configuration in it, instead of tons of small files, like file only with the Flake 8 definitions and only with your coverage settings and so on. And most of those tools now integrate with PyProject.toml and also want to integrate this. So this is definitely the near-term goal for PyScaffold, and also to have an update path for this next version. We are evaluating right now, for instance, mkdocs, if this could be something, a switch to mkdocs. So this is rather an idea I'm having right now, but there's still going to be a lot of discussion. Anderson is the core maintainer. I'm going to discuss it with him. So it's not yet decided. This is something then more integration of MyPy, and to make it easier for people to then start with static type checking. So this would be something that's like midterm. And also we've really seen that people like Markdown much more than restructured text, and you can have it already in PyScaffold with the Markdown plugin, which is, for instance, also by default install if you use the data science project plugin or extension. I think this should be like already in the default core setup, so that you have Markdown by default. So this is also rather near term. And then long term, I really don't know. There's so much pace in Python's development. Let's see.
Are there any other aspects of the PyScaffold project or the overall space of kind of managing the structure and best practices around the development of an application in Python that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
Just like to mention also that if you want to contribute to PyScaffold, and if you have new ideas, or if you want to evaluate especially tools like Catch, PDM, and so on, and maybe have also a sister project or something that maybe works together with PyScaffold and helps or make suggestions that how you can, or how to use virtual environments and isolated environments, or want to help us with adding documentation about this, I mean, this would be really valuable. Other than that, I think this whole Python packaging and structuring your project is really a huge rabbit hole. So if you start looking into this, you will find a lot of EuroPython and PyCon talks going back to 2000 something, where people discuss about the different ways of doing things. So it's actually, the less you care about this and the more you concentrate on your actual work or whatever you want to do. So I think I have no more suggestion that you should look into something. So there's a few blog posts I could maybe add to the references of this podcast. I think one important thing that I see, especially in the field of data science, so people are using a lot of Jupyter and Jupyter Lab, and this brings own challenges of how to integrate this in a nice way into larger projects. So people start with one notebook, and then they realize, okay, the code is growing and growing, And at this point, how to migrate this into a proper Python project with the help of PyScaffold, it helps a lot. And we've also written one blog post about this. This is definitely worth a read, I would say, for people in the field of data science, because they're the software craftsmanship, so to say, there's still a lot of potential, let's say it this way.
Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing and contribute to PyScaffold, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And with that, I'll move us into the picks. This week, I'm going to choose the Daredevil TV series. I just started watching. Originally was aired on Netflix, and now it's on Disney+. But definitely a very well put together show, a lot of interesting themes and interesting characters. So definitely recommend giving that a shot if you're into any of the superhero shows or genre. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Florian. Do you have any picks this week?
Yeah, so we started watching The Peripherals. It's on Amazon Prime. It's by the creators of Westworld, which was already like a really cool TV show. I think there's season 4 also running right now. I haven't checked it out yet. But it's the second episode we have seen, and it's really interesting, a really cool show, kind of sci-fi, but also a little bit mystery. You really have to think what's going on. So if you are a fan of Westworld, where you also don't know exactly how things are, and it's a little bit mysterious. So it's a really cool show. So I'm going to continue.
Thank you again for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you've been doing on PyScaffold. It's definitely a very interesting project, and it's always great to have people contributing to helping to cement and share their thoughts on what constitutes best practices for how to structure your Python projects. So appreciate all the time and energy that you've been putting into helping save time and energy for everybody else who wants to just build something. So thank you again for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you too. And thanks for having me. It was really a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other shows, the Data Engineering Podcast, which covers the latest on modern data management, and the Machine Learning Podcast, which helps you go from idea to production with machine learning. Visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@pythonpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.